In the spring of 2009, in Banner County, in the high, dry corner of western Nebraska, where the land tilts up toward Wyoming and the wind never quits, a man named Walt Brenner stood at the edge of a field that other men called dead and listened to a county agronomist tell him he was farming a graveyard. The agronomist's name was Dale Hoyt. He had a clipboard, a clean white pickup, a soil report that said the northwest quarter of the Brenner place carried so much sodium and so little life that nothing of value would ever grow there again. He called it a write-off. He said the kindest thing Walt could do was enroll the ground in a conservation set-aside and let the government pay him to walk away from it. He was not unkind when he said it. He believed it the way a man believes the floor will hold his weight. 14 years later, in the fall of 2023, a barley buyer from a Kraft malt house drove 400 miles to stand on that same quarter, ran a handful of dark, crumbling soil through his fingers, and offered Walt a price per bushel that the rest of the county could not have gotten if they had prayed for it. The number he wrote on the contract was large enough that when Walt's granddaughter read it aloud at the kitchen table, the room went quiet for a long time. This is the story of the years between those two afternoons, of a pile of yellow waste, a gas plant left at the fence line and forgot about, and of how one stubborn old man turned the thing everyone called poison into the richest ground in 3 counties. Stay with me, because the way he did it is real, and you can understand every step of it. Let me tell you about Walt Brenner first, because the dismissal only matters if you know the man it landed on. He was 66 that spring, born on the place in 1943, and he had worked the same 1,800 acres his whole life, the way some men work a single sentence until it is exactly true. He was known for 2 things in Banner County. The first was that he almost never spoke at the coffee shop in Harrisburg, and when he did, the room leaned in. The second was that he could tell you what a soil would do by the way it broke in his hand, the smell of it after rain, the plants that volunteered along its margins. His father, Ott Brenner, had done the same, and Ott's father before him, and what they carried was not in any book. It was in the way they had watched one piece of ground for 100 years and remembered what it told them. The northwest quarter had always been the problem child. It sat low where the runoff gathered, and the subsoil there held a gray, slick, sodium-heavy clay that the old-timers called gumbo and the chemists called sodic. When it was wet, it sealed up tight as a drum and shed water like a tin roof. When it dried, it cracked into hard plates that turned a plow. Ott had fought it his whole life and mostly lost. By the time the ground came down to Walt, the quarter grew foxtail barley, kochia, and a thin gray crust of salt that bloomed white in August. The county called it alkali. Dale Hoyt called it a graveyard. And on the chemistry, he was not wrong. He was only wrong about time. To understand what Walt understood, you have to understand what sodic soil actually is, because the whole story turns on it. In good ground, the tiny clay particles clump together into crumbs, and between those crumbs are spaces where air moves and water drains and roots breathe. The clumping is held together, in part by calcium, which sits on the clay like a rivet and binds particle to particle. When sodium takes calcium's place on that clay, the rivets come out. The particles repel each other and scatter, the crumbs collapse into a dense, airless paste, and the soil seals. Water cannot enter, roots cannot push through. That is what had happened to the Northwest, quarter over 10,000 years of poor drainage. The fix, every agronomist knew, was to drive the sodium off the clay and put calcium back. The textbook answer was gypsum, calcium sulfate, hauled in by the ton at a cost that made the whole exercise a loss before the first truck rolled. Walt did not have money for gypsum. What Walt had, sitting at the corner of the northwest quarter, where his fence met the county road, was a problem that the rest of the county saw as an eyesore and a hazard. Across that road sat a sour gas processing plant, one of the small ones that pulled hydrogen sulfide out of the wells in the Niobrara field and burned it, or cooked it, into something safer. The byproduct of that process is elemental sulfur, bright canary yellow, and the plant produced more of it than it could ship. So for years, they had been molding it into great blocks and stacking them at the back of their lot, which happened to be the fence line of Walt's worst field. Rain washed the edges. Yellow dust blew onto his ground. In 1995, a section of the block pile slumped in a wet spring and spread sulfur across the first 2 acres inside his fence, and the plant, rather than haul it, paid him a small nuisance settlement and let it lie. For most men, that would have been the end of it, a ruined corner of a ruined field. But Walt had spent 60 years reading what ground does, and he had read his father's ledger, the one Ott kept in a cracked leather cover in the cellar, full of soil notes going back to 1931. And Walt knew a thing the textbook knew too, but nobody in the county had bothered to connect. He knew that elemental sulfur, left in soil where bacteria can reach it, does not stay sulfur. He knew the ground itself would change it. Let me tell you about that, because it is the engine of the whole story. There is a family of soil bacteria, the ones a chemist would call sulfuricizers, that make their living by eating elemental sulfur and breathing out acid. Specifically, they turn sulfur into sulfuric acid. Slowly, particle by particle, as long as the soil is warm and damp and has air. Now, sulfuric acid in a field sounds like a horror. But in a soil full of lime, which western Nebraska soil is, full of calcium locked up in chalky carbonate that plants cannot easily use, that acid does something quiet and enormous. It dissolves the lime, it pries the calcium loose from the carbonate, and sets it free in the water, around the clay. And that freed calcium goes, looking for a place to land, and it lands on the clay, and it knocks the sodium off, rivet by rivet, and the sodium washes down and away with the snowmelt. The crumbs reform. The soil opens. Air comes back. It is gypsum's chemistry, done for free, by bacteria, using a waste product a gas plant could not give away. It is just slow. It takes years. And years were the one thing the county was sure Walt did not have, and the one thing he was willing to spend. So in 1995, while Dale Hoyt was still a young man and the graveyard verdict was years off, Walt began. He did not announce it. He drove his old flatbed across the county road to the plant office and asked the foreman, a tired man named Pruitt, whether he could take the broken sulfur off their hands. And Pruitt looked at him the way you look at a man asking to haul away your trash, and signed a paper that made it Walt's problem instead of theirs. Over the next 2 winters, Walt hauled it himself, load after load of the canary fragments, his breath fogging, and the dog Ace riding in the cab with his nose to the glass, and he ran the yellow stuff through a borrowed lime spreader he had to weld a new auger into because the sulfur ate the steel. He spread it thin across the worst 40 acres of the northwest quarter. At a rate he had worked out at the kitchen table, over a winter, 1,000 pounds to the acre, no more. A figure he took half from his father's ledger and half from a brittle extension bulletin printed in 1962 that nobody at the county office remembered existed. He measured it by the spreader's pass and the weight on the truck scale at the elevator, and he wrote each load in the back of Ott's ledger in pencil. The date and the acre and the pounds, the way his father had taught him that a thing unwritten is a thing half done. Then he did the hardest thing, which was to wait, and to keep the ground alive while he waited. A dead soil cannot heal itself, because the bacteria that do the work need to be fed, and what feeds them is living roots, leaking sugar into the ground. So Walt seeded the bare salt scald with the only things that would grow there: tall wheatgrass and a tough, salt-tolerant clover, not to cut, not to sell, but to keep something green rooted in the dirt all season long. The first year, half of it failed and blew out in the wind, and the white salt crust came back across the bare spots like frost in August. And any sensible man watching would have called it proof the thing could not be done. Walt reseeded the failures the next spring and said nothing. He turned a dozen yearling steers onto the thin grass for a few weeks each summer, not to fatten them, but to let them bite the growth and tramp it and drop their manure, cycling the green back into the ground as food for the life underneath, then pulled them off before they could hurt the fragile sod. He did not plow. Not once in 28 years did a plow touch that ground, because plowing would have torn apart the delicate new structure. The worms and the roots were building and turned the buried salt back up to the surface besides. He let the freeze and the thaw and the worms do the tillage. The land tills itself, Ott had told him once, if you are patient enough to let it, and most men are not. Now I want you to hold that picture: an old man spreading yellow waste on a dead field and seeding weeds on purpose, because that is the picture the county held too, and it explains the dismissal. Let me tell you about the man on the other side of the fence, because the niche of this story is two kinds of knowing, and Dale Hoyt was the other kind, and he was not a fool. Dale Hoyt was 40 in 2009, a county extension agronomist with a master's degree in soil science from a good land-grant university. And he was, by every honest account, a sincere and intelligent man who had helped a great many farmers in Banner County make a great many sound decisions. He was not a bad man. He simply believed that the measurable was the real, that a soil was the sum of the numbers on its report, and that a man who could not show him a return on a spreadsheet was a man indulging a sentiment. When he pulled samples from the northwest quarter that spring and ran them, the sodium reading was still high because the chemistry was only half finished, and the organic matter was climbing, but from such a low floor that it did not impress him. He saw a field that by his model should have been impossible. Growing a stand of grass it had no business growing. And instead of asking how, he wrote down what his training told him: salt scald, sodic subsoil, marginal at best, recommend retirement. He told Walt as much, standing at the field edge with his clipboard, and he softened it the way confident men soften things, with a word that was meant to be kind and landed like a slap. He called Walt's work a hobby. He said it the way you would say it to a child who had built something out of mud. A man your age, he said, ought to be taking the easy money on the set-aside, not chasing a hobby on ground God already gave up on. Walt looked at the field for a while. Then he said the only thing he said that whole afternoon. He told Dale that God had not given up on it, that God was busy, and it took God a while. Then he went back to fix a fence, and Dale drove off in his clean white truck, believing he had done a kindness. Which brings us to the man Walt's story was running against. Because every story like this has a second farmer, the one who did everything right by the book, and was rewarded for it until he wasn't. His name was Marv Kessler, and his place lay just east of Walt's, across a single wire fence, and Marv was everything the county admired. He was younger than Walt by 20 years, ambitious, quick to laugh. And he listened to men like Dale Hoyt the way Walt listened to the ground. Around the same years, Walt was spreading sulfur and waiting. Marv was building the kind of operation the extension office held up as a model at every winter meeting. He drilled an irrigation well 400 feet down into the aquifer and put up a center pivot sprinkler, a quarter-mile arm of galvanized steel on wheeled towers that crept across his ground in a slow circle, throwing water in a fine mist. A machine so large you could see it turning from the county road. He financed the well and the pump and the pivot together on a note that ran. By the time the last invoice was paid, to $460,000, he tore out the grass his own father had left him and planted corn fence to fence, the high-input kind that the spreadsheets loved. Every acre the same hybrid, every acre fed the same nitrogen, every acre watered on the same schedule, a computer set. For a good 10 years it worked, and worked well. Marv's corn came up in rows, so straight and so green that people slowed their trucks on the county road to look at it, and the extension office brought visitors out to stand at the edge of his pivot circle and admire what good advice and good steel could do. He paid his note. He bought a new truck. At the coffee shop in Harrisburg, his name came up the way a winning team's comes up, and nobody, in those years, was down to look at the gray field across the fence where an old man was growing weeds on purpose and writing pencil notes in a dead man's ledger. To the county, Marv Kessler was the future, and Walt Brenner was a sad and stubborn past. To the bank that held Marv's note, the pivot was an asset, and the grass it replaced had been waste. To Walt, watching the water mist rise off his neighbor's corn on a 90-degree afternoon and burn away in the wind, before half of it reached the ground, it was something else entirely. He never said so. It was not his place to say, and saying it would have changed nothing. He only watched and remembered the way he watched and remembered everything. I'll let you sit with that contrast for a moment, the two fields along the same road, because it is the contrast the whole county lived inside for more than a decade. And if you have ever been the one whose slow, quiet work nobody could see the point of, you already know which fence line you would have wanted to stand on. Then let me tell you what happened next, because in 2014, the third character in this story came home. And she did not believe her grandfather any more than Dale Hoyt did. Her name was Nora. She was Walt's granddaughter, 24 that year. And she had just finished a degree in agricultural economics at the university, and she came back to Banner County, full of the language of margins and break-evens and cost per bushel, with a laptop and a head full of models that closed. She loved her grandfather the way you love a man you are also a little embarrassed by. She had grown up hearing the county's gentle jokes about the Brenner graveyard, had laughed at a few of them herself before she was old enough to know better. And she had gone away to school and learned a whole clean vocabulary that explained to her complete satisfaction why the jokes were fair. When she walked the Northwest Quarter with Walt, that first summer home, she did the arithmetic out loud as they went, because she could not help it. The sulfur was free. She granted him that fine. But the 20 years of foregone income on 40 acres, she said, the cost of seed for grass he never sold, the dozen yearlings that grazed, instead of going fat to market, the diesel to haul the loads, all of it added up, and she had added it up to a number with a minus in front of it. She told him so at the kitchen table that evening, gently, the way Dale had at the field edge, with a kindness that was its own kind of certainty. The model does not close, Grandpa, she said. She said, not unkindly, that he had spent 2 decades farming a feeling. Walt did not argue with her. He never argued with anyone. He had the blue heeler, Ace, at his feet, a quick gray and blue dog with one ear that stood and one that folded, who went everywhere. Walt went and lay at the edge of whatever field Walt worked, watching him with the patience of a thing that has nowhere else it would rather be. That summer, Walt simply took Nora and the dog out to the quarter every few weeks and showed her things, and showed her in silence, because he had learned long ago that a thing a person discovers will hold, where a thing they are told will not. He did not lecture. The first time, he took a shovel and dug into the worst corner, and then he walked her to the shed and took down a glass canning jar. He had filled in 1995, labeled in pencil, full of the original ground, dried hard and gray and dead as gravel, and he set it in her hand. "Feel that," he said, and that was all. Then back at the field, he dug a fresh shovelful from the same spot, the spot the jar had come from, and he crumbled it into her open hands, dark and loose and cool, smelling of rain and cut roots, threaded through with fine white fungal strands, like spun thread and shot through with the round, slow tunnels of earthworms. He did not tell her what it meant. He let the two handfuls of soil, the dead one in the jar and the living one in her palm, argue with her degree. And across that first summer and into the next, they began, slowly, to win. Let me tell you about what those two handfuls actually showed her, because this is the second mechanism, and it is the one that made the reveal possible. When the sulfur opened the soil and let air and water back in, it did not just fix the chemistry. It started a living engine. Roots could finally grow deep, and roots leak sugar into the soil. And that sugar feeds fungi and bacteria. And those organisms glue soil particles into stable crumbs and build the dark stable carbon that farmers call organic matter. Organic matter is the whole game. Every 1% of it in the top foot of an acre holds something on the order of 25,000 gallons of extra water, water that stays in the ground through a dry July, instead of running off a sealed surface. It feeds slowly, releasing nitrogen as it breaks down. It is, in plain terms, the difference between a soil that is merely alive and a soil that is rich. Walt's father's ledger had a line in it, written in 1931, that Walt had read so many times he had it by heart. "The dirt is a bank," Ott had written, "and most men only ever make withdrawals." Walt had spent 20 years making deposits, where everyone else saw an empty account. By 2016, Nora had stopped doing the arithmetic that proved her grandfather wrong, and started doing the arithmetic that might prove him right. She pulled the soil tests herself, year over year, and built a chart. And the chart did something her degree had not prepared her for. The sodium that Dale had measured as a death sentence was falling year after year, washing down and out with each snowmelt as the freed calcium took its place. And the organic matter, which had started near 0.5% on the scald, the floor of dead ground, had climbed past 2% and was still climbing. She took the chart to Dale Hoyt's office, not to argue, but because she still half believed he would explain why it didn't matter. Dale looked at it a long moment. Then he said the chart was interesting, but anecdotal, that no one field proved nothing, that she would learn the difference between a data point and a trend. He was patient, and he was certain. He called it an anomaly. He was, again, not cruel. His model had simply never failed in front of him, and a man whose model has never failed cannot easily imagine that it will. Then came the dry years, and the dry years settled the argument that no chart could. Let me tell you about the drought, because this is where the two roads, Walt's and Marv's, finally came to the place they had been heading the whole time. Starting in the summer of 2021 and deepening brutally through 2022, the worst drought in 40 years gripped the high plains. The rains quit. The subsoil moisture that a normal year banks up was gone, and the heat came on top of it. Weeks of days over 100, the kind of heat that pulls water out of a plant faster than its roots can pull it from the ground. For Marv Kessler, the drought was a slow catastrophe written in water and money, and it arrived not as a single blow, but as a steady tightening through 2 summers. His corn needed water every week, or it died, and the only water was what his pump could throw. And that was the trap built into the whole design. In the summer of 2022, the aquifer he drew from dropped, the way an overdrawn account drops, and the well's output fell with it, the flow at the pivot thinning even as the crop's thirst climbed. The Natural Resources District, watching the water table fall across the whole county, put restrictions on pumping hours besides, so that on the hottest weeks, Marv could not run the pivot when the corn needed it most. His electric bill to run that pump through the heat ran past $40,000 in a single season. Money spent to throw water at a crop that burned anyway. The ears came short and chalky, kernels missing in rows, and when the combine finally went through, he brought in less than half a normal crop on ground that had cost him more to farm than it ever had, and the note did not care. The $460,000 note on the well and the pivot and the pump came due on its schedule. Indifferent to the weather, and in the fall of 2022, Marv sat at his own kitchen table with his own figures spread in front of him and could not make the model close. They were the same words Nora had once used about her grandfather, and the irony of it would have been cruel if anyone had said it out loud. Nobody did. Marv was a good man who had followed good advice from sincere people who had also believed the floor would hold. The structural truth of the thing was simply that he had built a system that could only run one way, full out, and could not bend. And the weather had bent it until something broke. On the northwest quarter, the same heat fell on the same county, and the ground answered it in a different language. Walt's 40 acres held. The soil he had spent 27 years building, dark and crumbed and threaded with deep roots and the old open channels worms and dead roots leave behind, drank in what little rain came, instead of shedding it off a sealed crust, and then held that water the way a deep sponge holds water, releasing it slowly up to the crop through the worst of the heat. He was not irrigating. He had no pump, no well, no note, no electric bill, nothing to run and nothing to pay. What he had was organic matter, the 4.5% of it that he and Nora had built in the top foot from, a starting floor of 0.5%, and every single point of that carbon was holding its thousands of gallons of water in the ground, where the roots could reach down and find it. While Marv's irrigated corn burned a mile away under its own thinning mist, Walt's dryland barley, the salt-tolerant, drought-hardy malting variety Nora had spent a winter talking him into seeding on the reclaimed ground, stood green into July and filled its heads while the rest of the county went brown. Which brings us back to the buyer and to the afternoon the whole story had been walking toward. Nora was the one who had found him. In her new arithmetic, she had stopped asking how to sell more bushels and started asking who paid the most for the rarest thing. And what was rare, she realized, was exactly what her grandfather had made. A craft malt house 2 states away built its reputation on single origin barley with a flavor that came from a particular soil, and they could not get enough barley grown on living, mineral-rich, unirrigated ground. She sent them a sample from the 2022 harvest. In September of 2023, after the second strong crop in a row off ground the county had written off, the head buyer drove the 400 miles himself to see the field that had grown it. His name was Tomas, and he said very little, which is the way of people who are sure of what they are looking for. He walked the barley ground for the better part of an hour with Walt and Nora, the dog Ace trotting the fence line ahead of them with his nose down, and he stopped now and then to pull a single head of barley and roll the grains out into his palm and chew one slowly, looking at nothing, and to crouch and dig a little soil with his fingers and bring it to his face and smell it. He had bought barley off 1,000 fields in 12 states, the buyer of a malt house that staked its whole name on the idea that a grain carries, the taste of the ground it grew in. He did not talk about any of that. At the end of the hour, he crouched once more at the field edge and ran a full handful of Walt's dark, crumbled soil through his fingers, slowly the way a man counts something precious. And then he stood and brushed his hands and asked the only real question he asked all day. He asked how long it had taken. Walt looked out at the field a moment. 28 years, he said. Tomas nodded, slow and certain, like a man who has just heard a price and finds it lower than what the thing is worth. Then they went to the kitchen's table, and Tomas wrote his offer on a single sheet, a multi-year contract ad for the entire barley crop off the reclaimed quarter at a price per bushel, and slid it across the table. Nora picked it up to read it to her grandfather, because Walt's eyes were not what they were. She got the price out, and then she stopped. The number on the page was $9.40 a bushel. It does not sound like much, set down plain like that. But the county elevator that fall was paying a little over $6 for ordinary barley, and under $5 for feed, and Walt's reclaimed 40 acres the graveyard was yielding near 90 bushels to the acre of grain a malt house would fight to buy. The arithmetic of it, run all the way out, came to more clean profit off those 40 written-off acres than Marv Kessler had cleared off his whole irrigated section in a good year, and far more than he had cleared in the bad ones. Nora read the number twice. Then she set the page down, and the kitchen was quiet, and the only sound was Ace's tail going once against the floor. And the figure sat in the middle of the table with a weight out of all proportion to its size. Nobody said anything for a while. Walt looked at the contract, and then out the window toward the quarter he could not quite see from the chair. And his hand found the dog's head. The number had landed harder than any number that Small has a right to land, because it was not really a price. It was a verdict, 28 years in coming, on which of two kinds of knowing had been right. In the quiet that followed, nothing was said. The clock ran. The dog breathed. Dale Hoyt heard about it the way everyone in a small county hears about things. He came out one more time that fall, on his own, without his clipboard. He was 54 by then, gray at the temples, and his model had failed in front of him. Slowly, over 14 years, in a way he could no longer call an anomaly. He stood at the field edge where he had once said graveyard, and he looked at the barley stubble and the dark soil for a long time. Then he asked Walt a question, and it was not the question of a man making an example of anyone. He asked if he could bring his soil science students out in the spring to see it and to have Walt explain how it was done. He said he had been teaching them a model, and the model had been missing something. And he thought the something was standing in this field. Walt said they could come. That was the whole of the recalibration. There was no apology asked for, and none needed. A sincere man had simply seen the world correct his certainty, and he had been honest enough to update. Let me tell you what Walt did with the verdict, because the niche of a story like this is not the number. It is what the number is for. He did not buy more land. He did not drill a well, or sign a note, or scale up the way the spreadsheets would have urged. He kept the operation exactly the size his ground could feed without strain, which was the whole point and always had been. What he did instead was teach. The next spring and the springs after, neighbors who had slowed their trucks to look at Marv's corn now slowed to look at Walt's soil, and they came to the field edge and asked. And Walt showed them the two handfuls of dirt, the jar of dead gray ground, and the living dark crumb beside it. He sold his neighbors no product. He gave them the method, the rate of sulfur off his father's ledger, the grass and gray's patience, the refusal to plow. 11 other farms in Banner and Kimball counties started their own slow reclamation. Off Walt's instruction over the next 3 years, each one a corner of marginal alkali ground that the reports had written off, and Walt drove out to walk every one of them at least once. Spreader rates, penciled on a scrap of paper in his shirt pocket. In time, that list of 11 came to include a corner of Marv Kessler's place because Walt had quietly helped Marv find his footing when the irrigated dream came apart, walking him through a restructure onto dryland ground and a stand of the same hardy grass, asking nothing for it, and the two old neighbors ended up leaning on the same wire fence again of an evening, the way they had before the pivot ever went up. And Nora stayed, the granddaughter who had come home to prove the model and been converted by 2 handfuls of soil, took up the whole of it. She took Ott Brenner's cracked leather ledger, the one that began in 1931, and she did not put it in a museum. She kept writing in it. She added the sulfur rates and the organic matter charts and the barley contracts in her own hand. Beneath her great-great-grandfather's, the bank of the dirt now 90 years deep and still taking deposits. She is farming the place now, with the old dog's grandpup at her heel, and the field that was a graveyard is the richest ground in 3 counties. And she can tell you exactly how it got that way. Here is the thing the whole story comes down to, the thing Walt knew, and Dale had to learn, and Marv paid to find out. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they do not measure the same things. One kind is wide and fast and confident. It reads the soil report, runs the model, prices the bushel, and it is right about almost everything that can be counted in a single season. The other kind is narrow and slow and quiet. It watches one piece of ground for 100 years and remembers what it said. It knows that a field is not the sum of its numbers on a given afternoon, but a living thing moving through time, and that the most valuable things a soil holds are exactly the things the report cannot see. The water and the carbon, the calcium working loose in the dark, the bacteria turning a waste pile into wealth, one particle at a time. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are 2 different things. What is rigid breaks when the weather turns, and what is patient endures. The dirt is a bank, and most men only ever make withdrawals. Walt Brenner spent 28 years making deposits in an account. Everyone told him was empty, and the land, which keeps a longer ledger than any of us, paid him back in full. Out at the edge of the quarter, in the late light, the dog still lies down where the dead ground used to be and watches the grain move in the wind.